When society pushes a grieving widow and her 2 children into the ruins of a fire-scorched shack on the edge of a forgotten town, they expect nothing but ash and despair. But beneath the charred floorboards lies something that was meant to stay buried. A discovery so powerful it will either destroy what's left of their broken family or resurrect them into something they never imagined possible. This is not just a story of survival. This is a story of what happens when the ground beneath your suffering finally cracks open and reveals the truth you were never supposed to find. If this opening hooked you, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens when hope is buried 6 feet under and someone refuses to stop digging. The shack stood like a skeleton stripped of flesh, its blackened bones jutting against the pale morning sky. Margaret stood before it with her children pressed against her sides, their small hands clutching the fabric of her worn coat as if it were the last piece of solid ground in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath their feet. The wind carried the scent of old fire, that acrid ghost of destruction that never truly leaves a place where flames have fed. She could taste it on her tongue, bitter and familiar, like the taste of every loss she had swallowed in the past year. The town council had made their decision with the kind of cold efficiency that only comes from people who have never known what it means to have nowhere left to fall. This burned wreckage at the edge of the county line, this monument to someone else's tragedy, would now be theirs. Not as a gift, not as mercy, but as a final statement that said louder than words ever could, "You are no longer welcome in the world you once belonged to." Her husband's death had been sudden, the kind that leaves no time for preparation, no space for goodbyes that feel adequate. One moment, he was the center of their small universe, a man whose laughter could fill a room and whose hands could fix anything broken. The next, he was gone, claimed by an accident so mundane it felt like an insult to the magnitude of the absence he left behind. But death, Margaret had learned, was only the first domino. After it fell came the others, the debts she didn't know existed, the insurance policy that somehow wasn't valid, the landlord who had been patient until patience became unprofitable, the friends who slowly stopped returning calls, the family members who offered prayers instead of rooms. The architecture of her life had collapsed with the precision of a controlled demolition, and she had watched it happen with the numb fascination of someone who no longer recognizes the person standing in the rubble. Her daughter, Emma, was 9 years old and had stopped asking questions 3 months ago. That silence was perhaps the most devastating thing of all, the way the light of curiosity had dimmed in her eyes, replaced by a watchfulness that belonged to someone much older, someone who had learned that questions often led to answers that hurt more than ignorance. Her son, Thomas, was 6 and still young enough to believe that if he was very good, very quiet, very invisible, then maybe the bad things would forget to find them. He hadn't laughed since the funeral, and Margaret sometimes caught herself straining to remember what his laughter sounded like, terrified that the memory was already beginning to fade like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. The social worker who delivered them to the shack had been professionally sympathetic, which somehow felt worse than open contempt. She spoke in the carefully neutral tones of someone trained to deliver bad news, as if it were simply information, devoid of moral weight. The shack had been condemned after the fire 3 years ago, she explained, but recently the county had reclassified it as marginally habitable, which was a bureaucratic way of saying that if you were desperate enough, it would keep the rain off your head. And that was more than some people had. There were forms to sign, warnings to acknowledge, liability waivers that ensured no one would be responsible if the structure decided to finish what the fire had started. Margaret had signed everything with a hand that no longer felt like it belonged to her, a stranger's hand moving across paper, agreeing to terms that reduced her family's existence to a calculated risk someone in an office had decided was acceptable. Now, standing before the structure that would be their home, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like ice cracking over deep water. This was the bottom. This was the place you arrived at when every other option had been exhausted. Every door had closed. Every hand that might have reached out had instead turned palm down in polite refusal. There was a strange clarity in it, a terrible freedom in knowing that there was nowhere left to fall. Her children's hands tightened in hers, and she felt the weight of their trust like an anchor pulling her simultaneously down into drowning and up towards something she couldn't yet name. She had failed them in every way that mattered, failed to keep their father alive, failed to keep their home, failed to maintain the illusion that adults knew what they were doing and that the world was fundamentally fair. But she had not yet failed to fight, and as she stared at the burned skeleton of a shack, she felt something ancient and stubborn kindle in her chest, something that refused to be extinguished no matter how many times the universe tried to snuff it out. They would walk through that door. They would make this ruin into something. Not because she believed it was possible, but because she had no other choice, and sometimes the absence of choice is the only compass you need. The first night in the shack was a lesson in the architecture of despair. The walls, though standing, were mapped with cracks that let in fingers of cold air, and the ceiling bore stains that formed continents of past water damage, dark brown geographies of decay. Margaret had scrubbed the floor for hours before allowing her children to set foot inside, her knees aching against the uneven boards, her hands raw from the cheap soap and cold water. The fire had consumed most of the interior, leaving only the skeletal frame and a few pieces of furniture too damaged to be worth salvaging. A table with 3 legs, a chair without a back, a cabinet whose door hung at an angle that suggested broken hinges and broken promises. She had arranged their few belongings, 2 suitcases and 3 garbage bags filled with clothes that smelled like the charity bin they came from. In the corner that seemed structurally soundest, creating a small island of familiarity in an ocean of strangeness. Emma had helped without being asked, her small hands folding clothes with the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual to ward off chaos. Thomas had sat on the floor holding his stuffed rabbit, the one toy he had insisted on keeping when everything else had to be left behind or sold, his eyes tracking his mother and sister with the vigilance of a small animal in an unfamiliar territory. When darkness came, it came absolutely the kind of rural darkness that city dwellers never truly experience, thick and textured and almost alive. Margaret lit the 3 candles she had bought at the dollar store, their small flames creating a circle of amber light that felt less like illumination and more like a fragile shield against the vast indifference pressing in from all sides. They ate dinner from cans that required no cooking, beans and peaches, and something labeled meat stew that tasted like salt and regret. Margaret had tried to make it feel normal, had tried to summon the energy for conversation, for questions about their day, for the small performances of maternal optimism that she knew children needed. But the words dried up in her throat, and instead they ate in a silence broken only by the scrape of spoons against tin and the distant sound of wind moving through the broken places of their new home. After dinner, she spread out the blanket she had been given by the church charity, thin, synthetic things that held neither warmth nor weight, and created makeshift beds for her children. Emma lay down without protest, but Thomas hesitated, his eyes on the shadows that danced beyond the candlelight. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "is Daddy ever coming back?" The question landed like a physical blow, stealing the breath from Margaret's lungs. She had answered this question before, in the days immediately after the funeral, using gentle words about heaven and angels and love that never dies. But those answers felt like lies now, fairy tales told to children to make unbearable truths bearable. She knelt beside her son, her hand smoothing the hair back from his forehead, and for a moment she considered lying again, weaving another pretty story that would let him sleep. But something in his eyes stopped her, a knowing that suggested he already understood more than she wanted him to, that he was asking not because he didn't know the answer, but because he needed to hear her acknowledge the reality they were all living. "No, baby," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was fracturing. "Daddy's not coming back. He's gone, and we have to figure out how to keep going without him." Thomas's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks, and Margaret gathered him into her arms, holding him while he sobbed against her shoulder with the kind of full-body grief that children feel before they learn to fragment it, to tuck it away into manageable pieces. Emma sat up from her blanket, her own face wet with silent tears, and crawled over to join them. And for a long time the three of them sat huddled together in the candlelight, a small constellation of sorrow in a burned-out ruin at the edge of a town that had forgotten they existed. Eventually the tears subsided into exhausted hiccups, and Margaret tucked her children into their makeshift beds, kissing their foreheads with lips that felt numb, whispering words of love that felt both desperately true and desperately insufficient. When they finally slept, Margaret sat alone in the darkness with a single candle still burning, her back against the damaged wall, staring at nothing. The exhaustion she felt went beyond physical tiredness, beyond the aching muscles and bruised knees and raw hands. It was a tiredness of the soul, a weariness that came from carrying the full weight of two lives that depended entirely on her when she could barely hold her own head above water. She thought about her husband, about the way he used to make everything seem possible, the way his confidence had been the foundation she'd built her life upon without ever realizing how much she had depended on that solidity. Without him, she felt like a building with the first floor removed, still somehow standing but defying the basic laws of structure, waiting for gravity to remember its job. The shack creaked and settled around her, old wood adjusting to new weight, and Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her. She had never been religious, had never found comfort in the idea of cosmic plans or divine purposes, but in that moment she found herself engaged in something that felt like prayer, though it had no words and no intended recipient. It was more like a wordless howling into the void, a desperate transmission of pain and determination sent out into the universe with no expectation of response, just the bare human need to say, "I am here, I am suffering, I am still fighting." When she finally blew out the candle and lay down on her own thin blanket, sleep came in fragments, broken by the unfamiliar sounds of the night and the familiar sounds of her own thoughts circling like vultures. The morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through gaps in the walls, turning the air inside the shack into visible streams of dust and particles. Margaret woke with her body aching in new ways, the hard floor having found every tender spot, every place where bone met ground without sufficient cushioning. Her children were still asleep, Emma's arm thrown across Thomas's chest in unconscious protection, and Margaret allowed herself a moment to simply watch them, to memorize the curve of their faces in repose, the vulnerability of sleep that made them look younger than their years. They were beautiful, she thought, beautiful in the way all children are beautiful, carriers of potential and promise that the world had not yet managed to fully crush. She rose quietly, stepping carefully to avoid the boards that creaked, and went outside to assess their situation in full daylight. The shack sat on a plot of land that had clearly been neglected for years, surrounded by overgrown grass and weeds that reached waist-high in places, dotted with the rusted remains of old farm equipment and mysterious metal shapes that might once have been tools or toys or art, now reduced to abstract sculptures of decay. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down a dirt road that had more in common with a suggestion than an actual path, and beyond that stretch field that had once been cultivated but now grew wild, reclaimed by nature with the patient inevitability of all abandoned human endeavors. The property ended at a line of trees, dark and dense, the kind of forest that had never been tamed or mapped, that existed in the liminal space between civilization and wilderness. Margaret felt drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain, felt the pull of those shadows like a question she didn't yet know how to ask. But there was too much to do, too many immediate needs demanding attention. So she turned back to the shack and began the work of making the impossible somehow functional. She needed to find water that was safe to drink, figure out the propane situation for the single-burner camp stove she had been given, assess which parts of the structure were genuinely dangerous and which were merely depressing, and somehow, impossibly, figure out how to generate enough income to feed her children while having no car, no job, and no prospects. The morning passed in a blur of small, grinding tasks that felt both essential and futile. She discovered a hand pump behind the shack that, after much effort, produced water that looked clear enough, though she made a mental note to boil everything before letting the children drink it. The propane tank was quarter full, which meant careful rationing and decisions about which meals deserved heat and which could be eaten cold. She found a broom with half its bristles missing and swept the floor, creating piles of ash and debris that she carried outside in her cupped hands, each trip a small statement of intention, a small refusal to accept the environment as it was. When Emma and Thomas woke, she fed them cereal with the water from the pump, and they ate quietly, their eyes adjusting to their new reality with the remarkable adaptability of children who have learned that home is not a place but a person, and as long as their mother was there, they would find a way to orient themselves. After breakfast, Margaret sent the children outside to play while she tackled the most daunting task of all, assessing the interior damage and deciding what could be salvaged, what needed to be removed, and what secrets the fire might have left behind. She started in the far corner, where the damage seemed most severe, prying up boards that were loose or rotted, stacking anything that might be useful for repairs or burning for warmth when the weather turned colder. The work was hard, physical labor that made her shoulders burn and her hands blister despite the worn glove she had found in one of the charity bags. But there was something almost meditative about it, a rhythm that allowed her mind to empty, to exist purely in the moment of effort and breath and small progress. She was halfway through removing a section of damaged flooring when her crowbar caught on something solid beneath the boards, something that resisted her leverage with unexpected firmness. Curious, she cleared away more of the damaged wood, revealing what appeared to be a metal box embedded in the subfloor, its surface scarred by fire but intact, locked with a mechanism that had fused partially in the heat. Margaret's heart began to beat faster, a response she couldn't quite justify, a sense that she had stumbled on as something significant, though she had no rational reason to believe it was anything more than old tools or worthless personal effects left behind by whoever had lived here before tragedy struck. She called to her children, and they came running with the eagerness of young people for whom everything new is potentially wonderful, their earlier sadness temporarily suspended by curiosity. Together they worked to free the box from its wooden prison, Margaret using the crowbar, while Emma and Thomas pulled at the boards with their small hands, all three of them working with the focused intensity of archaeologists uncovering something precious. When the box finally came free, it was heavier than Margaret expected, its weight suggesting contents of substance, of materiality, of things that might matter. The lock was stubborn, damaged by the heat, but still functional enough to resist their initial efforts, and Margaret had to strike it repeatedly with a rock before the mechanism finally surrendered with a grinding snap that sounded like capitulation. The lid opened with a creak that seemed loaded with theatrical significance, and inside, wrapped in cloth that had partially charred but still protected its contents, Margaret found something that made her breath catch in her throat, that made the morning sunlight streaming through the broken walls suddenly seem brighter, more full of possibility. Money, not coins or small bills, but stacks of worn currency bundled with rubber bands, mixed with what appeared to be documents, deeds, certificates, papers covered in handwriting that was elegant and old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a different era. There were also objects, jewelry that gleamed dully in the light, pocket watches, a collection of silver spoons, things of obvious value that had been deliberately hidden, deliberately preserved, waiting in darkness for someone to find them. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted one of the bundles of money, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities, her heart hammering with something that felt dangerous to name, something that tasted like hope, but might just be another form of despair. Emma and Thomas pressed close, their eyes wide, their understanding of what this meant not yet fully formed, but sensing their mother's reaction, sensing that something important had shifted. Margaret counted the bills with shaking fingers, her mathematician's mind automatically totaling even as her emotional mind struggled to process what this discovery meant. It was not a fortune, not enough to transform their lives completely, but it was enough to matter, enough to buy time, enough to create a buffer between them and the absolute edge of the precipice they had been teetering on. But as the initial shock subsided, Margaret felt something else creeping in, a cold shadow of understanding that twisted her stomach with anxiety. This money, these objects, this hidden cash, they belonged to someone. They had been hidden here for a reason, by someone who presumably expected to return and retrieve them. The fact that they remained suggested that return had never happened, that whoever had buried this treasure beneath the floorboards had either forgotten about it or been prevented from coming back by circumstances that Margaret could only imagine. And that meant that taking it, using it, building her family's survival upon it, was not a simple act of found fortune. It was a moral question, an ethical precipice of its own, as she found herself paralyzed between the desperate need pressing down on her from all sides and the ingrained principles that had governed her life before desperation became her primary state of being. She sat back on her heels, the money still in her hands, her children watching her with expressions that mixed hope and confusion, and Margaret felt the weight of the decision pressing on her with physical force. They needed this. Her children needed food, needed clothes that fit, needed the security of knowing there would be breakfast tomorrow and the day after. But someone else might need it too, might come looking for it, might have their own desperate story that made this cash their last hope rather than hers. How did you weigh one's suffering against another when both were legitimate, when both were profound, when a universe had somehow set up a situation where one person's salvation might be another person's continued damnation? The afternoon's sun shifted, and the light in the shack changed, becoming more golden, more forgiving, and in that light Margaret made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. She would take the money, use it to survive, to give her children what they needed. But she would also search for the owner, would make an effort to understand whose hidden treasure this had been, whose interrupted life had left this wealth buried and unclaimed. If she could find them, or find their heirs, she would return it with gratitude for the temporary salvation it provided. But if the trail led nowhere, if the past had truly closed over whoever had hidden this box, then she would accept it as the strange grace it appeared to be, the inexplicable mercy that sometimes arrives precisely when everything else has failed. "Is it ours, Mommy?" Thomas asked, his voice small and uncertain, and Margaret pulled him close, pulled both her children close, and kissed the tops of their heads. "I don't know, baby," she said honestly, "but it's going to help us, and we're going to be very careful with it, and very grateful, and we're going to try to do right by whoever left it here." Emma nodded, her face serious, already understanding in the way that children of hardship understand that nothing comes without complications, without questions, without costs that might not be apparent until much later. They carefully repacked the box, hiding it in a place only they would know, and Margaret felt something shift her chest, felt the constant pressure of anxiety ease slightly, felt the immediate terror of how they would eat tomorrow, how she would keep them clothed and sheltered, reseed just enough to let her breathe a little deeper. It was not security. She was too familiar with how quickly security could evaporate to mistake this for that. But it was possibility, it was breathing room, it was a chance to think beyond the next meal and start imagining something that might, with luck and effort and grace, resemble a future. The money changed things immediately and subtly, the way a foundation shifts beneath a house. Not always visible, but structurally significant. Margaret could buy food that required actual cooking, could purchase a small used generator from the hardware store in town that allowed them to have light after dark without depleting their candle supply, could get proper cleaning supplies and materials to begin making the shack less a testament to destruction and more a place where human life could unfold with some basic dignity. But the money also brought weight, a constant awareness of the box hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the corner, a persistent hum of moral uncertainty that accompanied her through days that were otherwise occupied with the grinding practicalities of poverty management. She started going into town regularly, making the 40-minute walk with Emma and Thomas, the three of them moving together down the dirt road like a small procession, their footsteps raising dust that caught in the morning light. The town itself was dying slowly, the way many rural towns die, hemorrhaging young people to cities and opportunities, leaving behind the elderly and the stubborn and the trapped. Main Street had more empty storefronts than occupied ones, their windows covered with newspaper or displaying sun-faded merchandise that no one had purchased in years. But there was still a grocery store, a hardware store, a diner with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the previous morning, and a library that operated 3 days a week in a building that had once been a bank, its vault now storing damaged books and outdated encyclopedias. The librarian was a woman named Judith, somewhere in her 60s, with steel-gray hair, cut short and practical, wearing glasses that hung on a chain around her neck, and clothing that suggested comfort had long ago won the war against fashion. She looked at Margaret and her children with eyes that held neither pity nor judgment, just a kind of neutral assessment, and when Margaret asked if they could get library cards, Judith simply handed her the forms without comment. The library became their sanctuary, a place where they could spend hours without spending money, where Emma could disappear into books about horses and adventure, where Thomas could look at picture books while sitting in the children's corner on cushions that had been patched multiple times, and where Margaret could use the ancient computer to search for information about the shack, about its history, about who might have lived there, and what tragedy had left it burned and abandoned. The records were fragmented, scattered across various databases and old newspaper archives that had been only partially digitized. But Margaret was patient, driven by both guilt and curiosity to understand the context of their unexpected salvation. She learned that the property had belonged to a man named William Hartley, who had purchased it in 1973 with his wife, Sarah. They had lived there for nearly 40 years, farming a small section of the land, mostly keeping to themselves in the way that some rural people do, creating a life that was insular and self-sufficient, measured in seasons rather than social calendars. William had been a veteran, had served in Vietnam, and the few mentions of him in local records suggested a man who had carried his war home with him in ways that made connection with others difficult but not impossible. Sarah had died in 2008, cancer that had been diagnosed too late and progressed too quickly. And after her death, William had become even more reclusive, his rare appearances in town noted by locals who remembered him as quiet, polite, increasingly absent. The fire had happened in 2012, on a January night when temperatures dropped below zero, likely caused by a malfunction in the old wood-burning stove that had been the shack's primary heat source. William's body had been found in the remains, identified through dental records, a death that the local paper had reported in a brief paragraph on page 7, noting that he had no surviving family, no one to claim his remains or his land, which had eventually reverted to the county after taxes went unpaid and legal notices went unanswered. Margaret read these details with her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes burning with tears she didn't fully understand. This man, this stranger who had lived and suffered and died in the place where she now slept, had buried his treasures beneath the floor and then been consumed by fire before he could retrieve them. His last act of preservation turned ultimately futile by the randomness of tragedy. She imagined him in the final moments, the smoke filling his lungs, the heat becoming unbearable, the realization that whatever plans he had made, whatever future he had imagined, were ending here in confusion and pain. And she felt the strange intimacy of inhabiting his space, of walking on floors where he had walked, of using his hidden cash to save herself and her children, a connection across time and death that felt both sacred and transgressive. She printed out the articles she found, spending precious coins on the copies, and brought them back to the shack to read again in the evening light, studying the grainy photograph of William that accompanied one of the obituaries, a formal portrait that looked military in its composition, his face weathered and serious, his eyes holding something that might have been sadness or might have been the simple weight of accumulated years. There was no mention of the money or the valuable she had found, no indication that anyone had known about his hidden cash or come looking for it. His estate, such as it was, had been minimal. No bank accounts of significance, no investments, no assets beyond the land itself, which suggested that the box beneath the floor had been his real wealth, his insurance policy, his secret kept even from whatever authorities or institutions might have claimed it after his death. Emma asked about the man whose house they lived in, and Margaret showed her the photograph, explaining as gently as she could that he had died here, that the fire had taken him but not his home completely, that in some way they were continuing a story that he had started, living a chapter he never got to complete. Emma studied the photograph with the intensity children bring to puzzles they are trying to solve, and finally asked the question that Margaret had been asking herself. "Do you think he would want us to have his money?" Margaret considered this carefully, understanding that her answer mattered, that she was teaching her daughter something about ethics and necessity and the complicated space between right and wrong, where most of real life actually happens. "I think," she said slowly, "that he hid it because he wanted to protect it, wanted to make sure it was there if he needed it. And I think he didn't have anyone else to leave it to, anyone else who would have inherited it if he'd lived long enough to make a will or tell someone where it was. So maybe the fact that we found it, that we needed it exactly when we did, maybe that's just how things sometimes work. What one person can't use gets passed to someone else, not through planning, but through accident and timing and whatever you want to call the force that makes some things happen when they need to." It was not a perfect answer, and Margaret knew it, but Emma nodded slowly, accepting the ambiguity because children who have lived through trauma learn early that the world does not offer clear categories, that good and bad bleed into each other, that sometimes survival requires accepting grace without fully understanding its origin or its cost. They sat together that evening, Margaret and her 2 children, and talked about William Hartley, making him real through speculation and imagination, giving him a story beyond the bare facts of birth and death and years endured. Thomas decided he must have been kind because he had lived with animals. There were remnants of an old chicken coop behind the shack, and kind people loved animals. Emma thought he must have been sad because he lived alone, and loneliness was the saddest thing she could imagine. Margaret added that he must have been strong, to have survived a war and built a life, and kept going even after losing his wife, and that strength was something to honor even when it ultimately wasn't enough to prevent tragedy. In this way, William Hartley became part of their family, a ghost made of stories and gratitude, a presence they acknowledged when they sat down to eat meals his hidden money had purchased, when they lay down on mattresses his unexpected gift had allowed them to buy. Margaret found herself talking to him sometimes, silently, thanking him for the chance he had inadvertently given them, apologizing for using what he had meant to save, promising to treat his final gift with respect and purpose. It was strange and probably irrational, but it helped, gave her a sense of accountability beyond her own survival instinct, made the money feel less like theft and more like inheritance, messy and unorthodox, but legitimate in the way that sometimes things are legitimate simply because they are necessary and there is no one left to object. The weeks turned into months, and the shack slowly transformed under Margaret's determined labor. She patched the roof with materials donated by a church group that was either genuinely kind or couldn't resist the narrative appeal of a widow and her children struggling heroically against poverty. Margaret didn't particularly care which, accepted the help with gratitude, and used it to make their shelter more secure against the weather that was beginning to turn as autumn approached. She sanded and refinished the floors, covering the burned sections with rugs she found at thrift stores, creating spaces that felt intentional rather than damaged. She hung curtains over the gaps in the walls, not to truly block the cold, but to create the illusion of boundaries, of inside and outside being meaningfully different categories. Emma and Thomas started school, catching the bus that stopped at the end of their dirt road each morning, and Margaret watched them go with pride and terror in equal measure, knowing that school meant exposure to other children who might notice their worn clothes or the address that marked them as living in the burned shack, the one everyone in town knew about, because small towns remember tragedies with the persistence of museums preserving artifacts. But it also meant structure, meant education, meant hours when they could be children among children rather than witnesses to their mother's constant struggle. Emma had always been a good student, and she dove into her classes with focused determination, bringing home papers marked with high grades that she displayed with quiet pride. Thomas was more hesitant, younger and more uncertain, clinging to his mother for long minutes before finally releasing her hand and climbing onto the bus. But his teacher sent home notes saying he was sweet, gentle, making friends slowly but genuinely. Margaret found work cleaning houses for the few remaining families in town who had enough money to hire help, but not enough to be particular about who they hired. It was hard work, physical and humbling, scrubbing other people's toilets and mopping other people's floors while they were at their jobs or running errands, moving through their homes like a ghost, invisible and necessary. But it paid, and she was good at it. Brought to the work the same fierce determination she brought to everything now, and slowly word spread that the widow living in the old Hartley place was reliable, thorough, didn't steal or gossip or require small talk. More clients came, enough that she could supplement what remained of William's hidden cash, could stretch it further, could begin to imagine a time when it would run out, and they would still be okay, because she would have built something sustainable from the breathing room it had provided. In the evenings, when her children were asleep and the generator hummed its mechanical lullaby, Margaret would sit at the table they had rescued and repaired and write in a notebook she had bought specifically for this purpose. She wrote down everything they had spent from William's cash, every dollar accounted for with the date and the purpose, creating a record that felt like a promise, like evidence that she had been a good steward of his unintended gift. She wrote about her children's progress, the small victories and setbacks of their days, the way they were slowly becoming versions of themselves that incorporated grief without being destroyed by it. And she wrote to William himself, letters that would never be sent, thank you notes to a dead man who had accidentally saved them, apologies for using what he had hidden, reports on what his money had purchased, food, shelter, time, hope, a chance to imagine tomorrow without the cold terror that had characterized every moment of their first weeks in the shack. One evening, as October turned the trees beyond the property into flames of color that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of the fire that had shaped their lives, Emma came to her with a question that suggested she had been thinking about things more deeply than her 9 years should require. "Mommy," she asked, "when we spend the last of William's money, what happens then? Do we have to leave?" Margaret pulled her daughter on her lap, though Emma was getting big for lap sitting, her legs dangling long and gangly, and held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, that particular child smell of shampoo and sunshine and innocent sweat. "No, baby," she said firmly, "we're not leaving. This is our home now, for as long as we want it to be. The money helped us get started, helped us survive until I could find work and we could get on our feet. But we're building something now, something that belongs to us, that we're creating day by day. William's gift gave us time, and we're using that time to make sure we don't need it anymore, to make sure we can stand on our own." Emma nodded against her shoulder, and Margaret felt the tension in her small body ease, felt the fear that had prompted the question dissipate in the warmth of reassurance. But later, after Emma had gone to bed and Margaret sat alone with her accounting notebook and her letters to a ghost, she acknowledged to herself that she didn't know if what she had told her daughter was true, didn't know if they would really be okay, if the word she had found would be steady enough, if the shack would hold through winter, if the universe that had shown them such relentless cruelty might not have more devastation in reserve, waiting for the moment when they finally felt safe, enough to be vulnerable again. But she also knew that children needed certainty even when adults had none, needed to believe that their parents had everything under control, even when everything was chaos barely contained. And so she had spoken with confidence she didn't feel, had constructed a story of security from materials as fragile as hope and determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. Winter arrived with the kind of cold that found every gap in their defenses, every crack in the walls, every place where Margaret's repairs were insufficient against the reality of nature's indifference. The shack became a study in temperature zones. Warm near the space heater, she ran sparingly to conserve their propane budget, increasingly cold as you moved toward the walls, frigid in the corners where frost formed on the inside of the windows in patterns that Emma traced with her finger, making art from ice. They slept together now, all three of them huddled under every blanket they owned, their body heat pooled and shared, making it through the nights in a cocoon of collective warmth that felt both primitive and profoundly intimate. Margaret's cleaning jobs became more physically punishing as she had to navigate icy roads on foot, arriving at houses shivering despite her layers, her hands so cold they could barely grip the mop handle until feeling gradually returned in painful prickles. One of her regular clients, a woman named Patricia who lived in one of the town's nicer houses, which meant it had been built in the last 30 years and had working insulation, noticed Margaret's condition and began leaving out thermoses of hot coffee and bags of food mark leftovers that were clearly fresh meals prepared specifically for Margaret to take home. It was charity disguised as practicality, and Margaret accepted it with gratitude that tasted like shame until she decided shame was a luxury she couldn't afford, and gratitude, without qualification, was the only appropriate response to kindness regardless of how it was packaged. Margaret printed the article and brought it home, showed it to her children over dinner that evening, and they talked about what it meant to be the kind of person who helps others even when you don't have much yourself, what it meant to create a legacy that outlives you in unexpected ways. Emma suggested they should do something to honor William, should find a way to thank him properly, and after some discussion, they decided to clean up the overgrown plot behind the shack where the remnants of the old chicken coop still stood. It became their project, their way of saying thank you to a man they had never met, spending weekend mornings clearing brush and pulling weeds and salvaging usable wood from the collapsed structure, creating something intentional from neglect. As they worked, Margaret told her children stories about William based on the fragments she had found in her research, weaving facts and speculation into a narrative that made him real, made him human, made him someone they could know despite the impossibility of ever meeting. She told them about his service in Vietnam, about the war that had shaped his generation and the scars it had left, about how he had chosen to deal with his own trauma by helping others rather than by closing himself off completely. She told them about Sarah, about the partnership they had built, about how they had created a life of service together, about how losing her must have hollowed him out in ways that made the fire 5 years later seem almost like an ending he had been moving toward, a giving up that looked like accident but might have been surrender. Thomas, who at 6 was still young enough to think literally about most things, asked if William was watching them now, if he could see them cleaning his property and living in his house. Margaret, who had no belief in an afterlife but understood the human need for continuity, for accountability to something beyond the self, said she didn't know, but that it didn't really matter. They were doing it because it was right, because they owed him something they could never fully repay, because gratitude demanded expression even when the person being thanked was beyond receiving it. Emma, always more metaphorical in her thinking. Said she thought William was there in the way people were always there when you remembered them, when you honored what they cared about, when you continued the work they started, and Margaret agreed that was probably the best way to think about it, the most useful way to hold the dead in relationship with the living. The chicken coop project expanded organically, becoming a general rehabilitation of the back area of the property. They found old tools in the shed, rusted but restorable, and Margaret taught her children how to clean and oil them, how to transform neglected objects back into functional items through patient labor. They discovered the remnants of what had once been a garden, its borders still visible beneath the weeds, and Emma became obsessed with the idea of planting vegetables there come spring, of growing their own food, of creating something that would make them less dependent on Margaret's uncertain income and more connected to the land they lived on. It was ambitious, probably unrealistic given their lack of experience and resources, but Margaret encouraged it anyway, understanding that children needed projects, needed dreams, needed to believe that effort could transform reality in positive directions. One February afternoon, when the temperature climbed into the 40s and felt almost tropical compared to the weeks of bitter cold they had endured, Margaret was working alone on the chicken coop renovation while her children were at school, and she found something wedged between two wall boards that had been partially burned but still structurally intact. It was a small leather journal, its cover water-damaged and fire-scarred but still holding together, its pages stiff and discolored but readable. Her heart hammering with the sense that she was about to trespass on something private and sacred, Margaret carefully opened the journal and began to read. It was William's diary, entries spanning from 2008, the year Sarah died, until just a few days before the fire that killed him. The handwriting was small, cramped, the words of someone writing for themselves rather than for an audience, thoughts recorded without editing or self-consciousness. Margaret knew she should stop, should respect his privacy even in death, but she couldn't, was pulled forward by the same magnetic need that made people read letters they found in old books or listen to conversations not meant for them. The human hunger to know another person's interior life, to understand the thoughts that never got spoken aloud. The early entries were raw with grief. William's pain over losing Sarah expressed in simple, devastating sentences. Woke up again and forgot she was gone. Worst moment of every day is remembering. Her chair is still in the corner. Can't move it. Can't sit in it. Can't even look at it without my throat closing up. 42 years. How am I supposed to know who I am without her here to remind me? Margaret read these entries with tears streaming down her face, recognizing the particular texture of that grief. The way losing someone rewires your entire reality, makes even breathing feel like a betrayal because you're still alive and they're not. But as the entries progressed, William's writing began to shift, began to document not just loss, but continuation, not just ending, but the stubborn persistence of life, even in the face of devastating absence. He wrote about the veterans he continued to help, about the men and women who passed through his home in various states of crisis, about the small victories of getting someone connected with healthcare or housed, or simply convinced that tomorrow might be worth seeing. He wrote about his routine, the daily tasks that structured his time, the garden he maintained, the chickens he tended, the small repairs he made to the shack that was slowly falling apart around him, but still functioned, still provided shelter, still held. And he wrote about the money, about his decision to hide his savings beneath the floor rather than trust it to banks or institutions. The entry was dated 2010, 2 years before his death, and it explained everything in simple terms that broke Margaret's heart. Don't trust banks after what happened in '08. Seen too many people lose everything when the systems fail. Keep my money here, where I can see it, where it's real. If something happens to me, if I die before I need it, maybe someone else will find it. Someone who needs it more than the government needs it for taxes or lawyers need it for fees. Rather have it go to a person than disappear into bureaucracy. Sarah would have liked that. She always believed in helping direct, person to person, no middlemen. So this is me trusting whoever finds this to need it, to use it, to let it be what I meant it to be, a safety net that catches someone. Margaret sat on the ground among the ruins of the chicken coop, the journal trembling in her hands, and wept with a complicated mixture of relief and gratitude and sorrow. He had meant it. He had intentionally left it there for whoever might find it, had chosen trust over control, had made a bet on human decency and need meeting in the space he was leaving behind. She was not a thief. She was not violating his intentions. She was fulfilling them, was exactly the person he had imagined might someday need what he had saved, was carrying forward his philosophy of direct help, person to person, need meeting resource without institutional interference. She finished reading the journal that evening after her children were asleep, sitting in the candlelight because the generator's fuel had run low and she was rationing until she could refill it, learning about William Hartley in his own words, understanding the particular shape of his loneliness and service and endurance. His last entry was dated 3 days before the fire, a brief note about the temperature dropping, about needing to be careful with the stove, about planning to go into town for supplies in the morning. There was no premonition of disaster, no final profound statement, just the ordinary notation of ordinary plans that would never be fulfilled, the abrupt end that comes for everyone eventually, but that always feels shocking in its mundane suddenness. Margaret added the journal to the box where she kept the photograph and articles about William, creating an archive of the man whose home they inhabited, whose money had saved them, whose philosophy of help and trust had reached across death to catch them when they fell. She wrote him another letter in her notebook, telling him they had found his journal, thanking him for his intentional generosity, promising to honor it not just by using his gift, but by passing it forward, by helping others when and how they could, by continuing the chain of grace that he had deliberately left unbroken. And she felt something in her chest, a sensation like a wound closing, like the constant low-grade guilt she had carried since finding the money finally easing, replaced by a sense of being chosen, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what someone who was now gone had hoped someone would do. Spring arrived with the kind of aggressive beauty that felt almost violent after the long monochrome winter, everything suddenly green and urgent and alive with a determination that seemed to mirror Margaret's own internal state. The garden project that had been abstract planning through the cold months became real work. Emma and Thomas outside every day after school with their mother, turning soil that was more clay than earth, mixing in compost they made from kitchen scraps and chicken manure from birds they had acquired through a program Judith had told Margaret about, unwanted hens from industrial farms, past their peak laying years but still productive enough for a family operation, given away free to anyone willing, to provide them a home and care. The chickens had been Emma's particular joy. These strange dinosaur birds with their rhythmic pecking and occasional eggs and surprisingly distinct personalities. She named each one after women she had read about in library books, Harriet and Rosa and Malala and Jane, and took seriously her responsibility for their welfare, checking on them multiple times a day, talking to them in a soft voice about her school day and her worries and her hopes, making them her confidants in the way some children made diary entries or prayers. Thomas preferred the garden itself, the direct cause and effect of seeds going into ground and green shoots emerging, the visible proof that effort could produce results, that things could grow even in difficult conditions if given minimal requirements of water and light and attention. Margaret watched her children engage with these projects and saw in them something she had feared was lost. Enthusiasm, investment in the future, the kind of hope that manifests as physical labor toward a distant goal. They were healing, she realized, not in the sense of returning to who they were before their father died and their life collapsed, but in the sense of becoming new versions of themselves, versions that incorporated loss without being defined solely by it, that could find purpose and even happiness in circumstances that were still far from ideal, but no longer actively desperate. Her cleaning business had stabilized into something almost sustainable, with enough regular clients that she could predict her income with reasonable accuracy, could plan expenses beyond the immediate week, could begin thinking in terms of months and seasons rather than days and hours. She had paid back into William's cash the amount she had spent, keeping meticulous records, treating it now as an emergency fund that she hoped never to need again, but that remained available, a psychological safety net that made risk-taking possible. She started saving money in a bank account, tiny amounts that would have embarrassed her before poverty taught her that every dollar mattered. That $10 saved each week was $500 a year, was the difference between crisis and managed difficulty. The town's perception of them had shifted, she noticed, from tragic charity cases to working poor making it, a subtle distinction that manifested in conversations that now asked how things were going instead of if they needed anything, in nods of acknowledgement that suggested respect rather than pity, in the way other parents at school pickup chatted with her about normal things. Teacher conferences and school events, and the ridiculous price of shoes for growing children, rather than carefully avoiding topics that might highlight the difference in their circumstances. Emma had made friends, real friends who came over to play in their garden and feed the chickens, and didn't seem to notice or care that the shack was still obviously a shack, still obviously marked by past fire and present poverty, because childhood friendships form around compatibility rather than economics when adults don't poison them with class consciousness. One afternoon in May, when the sun was warm enough to work outside comfortably and the garden was showing the green promise of vegetables that might actually mature into food they could eat, a truck pulled down their dirt road, unusual because no one came out here except the mail carrier once a week and the occasional lost driver needing directions. Margaret straightened from the tomato plant she was staking, wiping dirt from her hands, her body tensing with the residual wariness that came from months of living on the edge, where any unexpected change could be catastrophic. The truck stopped, and an elderly man climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body no longer responded with the quickness his mind expected. He was perhaps 80, wearing work clothes that had been washed so many times they had achieved that soft, thin quality of complete comfort, and he stood for a moment just looking at the shack at the garden, at Margaret and her children working in the spring sunshine, his expression complex and unreadable. Margaret walked toward him slowly, her children following behind her with the automatic wariness children develop when they've learned that not all strangers are safe, that adult interactions sometimes go badly in ways that affect kids most of all. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked, her tone polite but guarded, and the man turned his attention to her, his eyes, blue and faded like worn denim, studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was seeing more than her surface appearance, was reading some story written in her features and posture and the way she positioned herself between him and her children. "This is the old Hartley place," he said, and it wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. "I knew Bill. Served with him in Vietnam. Came out here sometimes, back when Sarah was alive, back when it was—" He gestured vaguely at the shack and the garden and the rehabilitated chicken coop. "Different. Heard it burned. Heard he died in it. Heard the county took it over and nobody lived here for years. But now," he trailed off, his eyes tracking over their improvements, the visible evidence of habitation and effort and life continuing. "We've been here since December," Margaret said carefully, unsure what this man wanted, whether his arrival was threat or neutral, or possibly even something good. "The county. They let us stay here. We're fixing it up, making it livable." The man nodded slowly, still looking around, and Margaret felt Emma press against her side, felt Thomas's small hand slip into hers, and she squeezed reassuringly while maintaining eye contact with this stranger who had known William, who represented a connection to the past they had been piecing together from fragments and research and found journals. Finally, the man looked back at her, and his face had softened into something that might have been sadness or might have been acceptance or might have been both. "Bill was a good man," he said quietly. "Fought demons most of his life, demons from the war and demons that were just his own brain chemistry, but he fought him by helping other people, by turning outward instead of inward. Him and Sarah, they probably saved a dozen lives I know about, probably more I don't. Men who would have ended up dead on the street if they hadn't had a place to go, if someone hadn't treated him like they still mattered. He paused, looking down at his boots, scuffed and worn and probably older than Margaret. I came out here because I wanted to see what happened to his place. Wanted to see if it was just empty and rotting or if somebody was using it. And I'm glad. I'm glad it's not empty. Bill would have hated the idea of it sitting useless. Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes, felt the weight of everything she had been carrying, the guilt and gratitude and constant uncertainty about whether she had any right to be here, to use what she had found, to build her family's survival on the ruins of someone else's tragedy. Suddenly shift, redistributed by this stranger's approval, by this confirmation that William would not have minded, would have possibly even been pleased by their presence, by the continuation of life in a place. That death had marked. We found, she started, then stopped, unsure how much to reveal, whether the money and valuables were something this man knew about, something he might have a claim to, something that might reignite all the moral questions she had worked so hard to resolve. But something in his expression, something in the way he had spoken about William, made her decide to trust. We found a box he had hidden, under the floor, money and some other things, and a journal. The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't look surprised, didn't look like this was news that changed anything. Bill didn't trust banks. Can't say I blame him. You use it. Yes, Margaret said simply, deciding that honesty was the only acceptable response. That lies to this man would be a betrayal of William's memory and her own integrity. We needed it. We didn't have anything. The money saved us. Let us survive until I could find work. I've been paying it back, keeping records, but she spread her hands helplessly. It saved us. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Margaret to Emma to Thomas, taking in their clean but worn clothes, their work-roughened hands, the evidence of poverty managed rather than escaped, of struggle continuing even if the immediate crisis had passed. Finally, he smiled, a small expression that transformed his face from stern to gentle, and nodded. Then it did what Bill meant it to do, he said firmly. He told me once, years ago, that he kept his savings hidden because he'd rather it help a person who needed it than disappear into the system. Said if he died and someone found it, that would be Providence, would be the universe making sure it went where it should. So you don't owe him anything, and you sure as hell don't owe me anything. You needed it. You used it. You're taking care of his place. That's the whole story, and it's a good one. Margaret found she was crying openly now, relief and validation and simple exhaustion combining into tears that wouldn't stop, and Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's waist while Thomas pressed his face against her hip, both children offering comfort they didn't fully understand but instinctively provided. The old man waited patiently until she had composed herself enough to speak, then reached into his truck and pulled out a cardboard box, carrying it over and setting it at her feet. Some of Bill's things, he explained. His military medals, some photographs, letters between him and Sarah from when they were courting. After he died, they went to the VFW post since he had no family, but we didn't know what to do with it. It didn't feel right just throwing him away. You're living in his place, taking care of it, honoring his memory, even if you never knew him. Seems like you should have these. Seems like they belong here more than in a storage closet gathering dust. Margaret accepted the box with trembling hands, looking down at the visible items on top. A faded photograph of a young William in uniform, smiling with the unguarded optimism of someone who hadn't yet seen combat, and a ribbon-tied bundle of letters in elegant handwriting that must have been Sarah's. These were treasures beyond monetary value, were pieces of a life, were evidence of love and service, and a story that deserved to be remembered. She looked up at the old man, this stranger who had become in the space of one conversation a kind of guardian, a keeper of history, a validator of her presence in this place. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. We'll take care of them. We'll make sure his story doesn't get lost. The old man nodded, satisfied, and started to turn back to his truck, then paused. One more thing. If you ever need work, or if you run into trouble, there's a group of us, Bill's old buddies and some of the folks he helped over the years. We look out for each other, help when we can. You're part of that now, whether you knew Bill directly or not. You need something, you call the VFW post and ask for Eddie. That's me. They'll know how to reach me. He handed her a business card, worn and outdated, with a phone number written in pen across the top, and Margaret took it knowing she probably wouldn't use it, wouldn't ask for help even when she needed it, because pride and independence and the fierce determination to make it on her own were too deeply ingrained. But knowing it existed, knowing there was a safety net beyond William's hidden money, beyond her own limited resources, made something in her chest feel lighter, made the world feel slightly less hostile, made the possibility of random kindness seem more real than it had in the long months since her husband's death had taught her that the universe could be cruel in arbitrary and devastating ways. Eddie drove away in his truck, dust rising from the road, and Margaret stood with her children and the box of William's personal effects, feeling like they had crossed some threshold, had moved from occupying William's space to genuinely inheriting it, to being chosen as the continuation of what he had started. They spent the evening going through the box together, Margaret explaining what the military medals meant, reading aloud selections from Sarah's letters that were appropriate for children, showing them photographs of William and Sarah throughout their decades together, watching them age from young and smooth-faced to weathered and gray, their smiles changing in quality but never disappearing, evidence of a partnership that had endured through time and difficulty and the particular challenges of loving someone who carried war inside them like a chronic illness. That night, after her children were asleep, Margaret took William's journal from its place in her archive and added a new entry on the first blank page she could find, knowing this was transgressive, but feeling it was necessary, wanting to close the circle between past and present in some tangible way. She wrote about their life in the shack, about how his hidden money had saved them, about the garden and the chickens and the slowly accumulating hope that maybe, possibly, they were going to make it. She wrote about Emma and Thomas, about the children who were growing up in the home he had built, who were learning about service and generosity and resilience from his example, even though they had never met him. And she wrote a final thank you, inadequate and heartfelt, a message to a dead man who would never read it, but whose presence she felt constantly, whose legacy was living and breathing and laughing in the space he had left behind. The revelation came on an ordinary Tuesday in June, the kind of day that feels suspended between spring and summer, the light golden and eternal, the air warm enough to work comfortably but not yet oppressive with the weight of deep heat. Margaret was alone, Emma and Thomas at school, her cleaning jobs finished early, and she had decided to tackle one of the tasks she had been avoiding for months, clearing out the old shed that stood behind the shack, a smaller structure that had been damaged by the fire but not destroyed, its door rusted shut, its interior unknown and therefore vaguely threatening in the way unexplored spaces always are. She had brought the crowbar, the same one she had used to open William's hidden box, and after significant effort managed to force the door open with a screech of protesting metal that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. The interior was dark and smelled of rot and old chemicals, and Margaret had to wait for her eyes to adjust before stepping inside carefully, testing each board before putting her full weight on it, aware that the floor might be compromised, that one wrong step could send her crashing through to whatever lay beneath. The shed was mostly empty, or mostly filled with things too damaged to be useful, warped tools, containers whose contents had long since evaporated or congealed into uselessness, the kind of accumulated junk that every storage space collects when people stop being discriminating about what deserves preservation. But in the back corner, covered with a tarp that had partially melted in the heat of the nearby fire, Margaret found something that stopped her breath in her lungs, that made time seem to slow and thicken. That changed everything about her understanding of William Hartley and his life and the money she had been using to rebuild their existence. It was a printing press, small and old-fashioned, the kind that hobbyists use for art projects and custom printing jobs, and beside it were boxes of paper and ink and plates carved with intricate designs. And on those plates, clearly visible even in the dim light filtering through the shed's damaged walls, were images of currency. $20 bills rendered in careful detail. The kind of detail that could only mean one thing. The kind of detail that made Margaret's stomach drop and her hands start shaking as she processed what she was looking at, what it meant, what had changed about everything she had believed about the man whose house she lived in and whose money had saved her family. William Hartley had been a counterfeiter. The money she had found, the bills bundled with rubber bands and hidden beneath the floor, were not savings carefully accumulated through legitimate work. They were forgeries, were illegal, were evidence of a crime that had gone undetected, that had died with him in a fire that no one suspected was anything other than tragic accident. Margaret felt the world tilting around her, felt every certainty crumbling, felt the moral ground she had so carefully constructed beneath her feet suddenly revealed as quicksand, as illusion, as a story she had told herself to make using the money acceptable when the truth was so much more complicated, so much darker, so much more morally ambiguous than she had ever imagined. She stumbled out of the shed, her breath coming in short gasps, her mind racing through implications and consequences and the terrible question of what this meant for her children, for the life they had been building on what she now knew was a foundation of fraud. She had been using counterfeit money. She had been passing illegal currency to shopkeepers and landlords and businesses, however unknowingly, had been participating in a crime without realizing it, had been building their survival on something that could collapse at any moment if anyone noticed, if anyone questioned, if the bills were somehow traced or identified or revealed as fake. The rest of the day passed in a blur of panic and calculation. Margaret examined every remaining bill in William's cash with a kind of scrutiny she should have applied months ago, looking for the signs of forgery she didn't know how to identify, trying to determine if they were good enough to pass undetected or if she had been incredibly lucky that no one had caught them yet. The bills looked real to her untrained eye, felt real, had the texture and weight and appearance of legitimate currency. But now that she knew they were fake, every imperfection seemed glaring, seemed like obvious evidence that should have triggered suspicion every time she used them. She thought about going to the police, confessing everything, throwing herself on the mercy of a legal system she had no reason to believe would be merciful, especially to someone who had technically been passing counterfeit currency, even if she hadn't known it was counterfeit. But that would mean losing everything, would mean potential prosecution, would mean her children going into foster care while she dealt with legal consequences, would mean destroying the fragile stability they had built, would mean losing the shack and the garden and the chickens and the life they had started to construct from ruins and hope and determination. And for what? For honesty? For integrity? For adherence to laws that seemed increasingly abstract when weighed against the immediate needs of her children, against the question of whether anyone was actually harmed by her using money that looked real enough to be accepted. But she also couldn't ignore it, couldn't unknow what she now knew, couldn't continue using the remaining money with the innocence she had felt before discovering the printing press and understanding what it meant. She was trapped between impossible choices, between confessing and facing consequences that would destroy them, or staying silent and living with the knowledge that their survival was built on fraud, that any moment someone might notice, might question, might bring everything crashing down around them in ways that would be worse for having been delayed. When Emma and Thomas came home from school, Margaret was sitting at the table with the box of remaining money in front of her, her face pale and drawn, and Emma immediately knew something was wrong with the instinct children develop when they've been through trauma, when they've learned to read adult moods as indicators of whether the ground is about to drop out from beneath them again. "Mommy," Emma asked carefully, and Margaret looked at her daughter, at her son, at these two people who were the center of her universe, who she would do anything to protect, who deserved better than to be caught in the moral quagmire she suddenly found herself swimming in. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "About the money. About William. About what I found today." She told them everything. About the printing press, about what it meant, about the terrible realization that the money that had saved them was not what she thought it was not the gift of a generous man, but the product of a desperate man's illegal enterprise, was complicated and morally ambiguous and potentially dangerous in ways she hadn't understood until now. Emma listened with growing comprehension, her young face serious and thoughtful, processing information that shouldn't be a child's burden, but that Margaret felt compelled to share, because keeping it secret felt like a betrayal of the honesty she had tried to maintain with her children through everything else. Thomas understood less completely, but grasped that something bad had happened with the money, that the thing that had been helping them was also somehow wrong, and he looked frightened in a way that broke Margaret's heart. "What are we going to do?" Emma asked finally. And Margaret realized she didn't have an answer, didn't have a plan, didn't have any clarity about the right path forward when every option seemed to lead to some form of disaster. They sat together in the fading light of that June evening, three people bound by blood and circumstance and the complicated love that makes families work even when everything else fails, and talked about something that should not have been their problem, that should not have been their decision, but had become it through the accident of discovery and need and William Hartley dying before he could be held accountable for his crimes. Margaret explained that they had already spent more than half of the counterfeit money, that it was too late to undo that particular use even if confession seemed like the right thing to do, that the world didn't offer do-overs when you realized midway through that you had been building on quicksand without knowing it. She explained that using the remaining money felt wrong now that she knew its origin, but that not using it might mean returning to the desperate poverty they had only recently climbed out of, might mean losing the shack and the chickens and the garden and all the tangible evidence that effort could change circumstances, that hope was sometimes justified, that they were going to make it. Emma, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a child who had learned to weigh consequences through lived experience rather than abstract ethics, pointed out that they hadn't known the money was fake, that using something you believed was legitimate was different from deliberately committing fraud, that intention mattered even if the law might not agree. She pointed out that William must have had reasons for counterfeiting, that maybe he did it to fund his work helping veterans, that maybe the crime was complicated rather than simple, that maybe the world was not as clear as adults sometimes pretended it was. Thomas added, in his simpler way, that William had wanted to help people, that the money was helping them, that helping people was good, even if the way you got the money to help them was bad. And wasn't the helping more important than where the money came from? These were not the answers Margaret wanted, because they were too close to the justifications she could feel herself constructing, the rationalizations that would let her keep using the money while maintaining some version of moral cleanliness, some story about necessity and ignorance and the greater good that would let her sleep at night. But they were also not wrong, were not simple failures of ethics, but genuine grappling with a situation that had no clean resolution, no option that left everyone innocent and consequences entirely avoided. She thought about William's journal, about his philosophy of helping people directly, person to person, about his distrust of institutions and systems, about the possibility that his counterfeiting was not greed but protest, not theft but redistribution, not crime, but something more complicated that the legal system was not equipped to understand or accommodate. In the end, Margaret made a decision that felt less like choosing and more like accepting the only path available, the only way forward that didn't require sacrificing everything they had built. They would stop using the counterfeit money, would lock it away, and treat it as what it was, evidence of someone else's crime that they had stumbled into, that they had benefited from without knowing its true nature, that they could not unuse but could refuse to continue using. They would survive on her cleaning income and the garden produce and the eggs from the chickens, and whatever grace the universe decided to extend them would build something real and legitimate and clean from the complicated foundation they had been given. And they would keep William's secret, would not report what they had found in the shed, would not turn his memory over to authorities who would reduce him to criminal rather than understanding him as the complicated, struggling, generous man he had apparently been, someone who contained multitudes and contradictions and did harm in service of help in ways that simple moral categories could not contain. They burned the contents of the shed the next day, the printing press and the plates and the paper and ink, feeding it all into a bonfire that seemed to purify through destruction, that turned evidence into ash and allowed them to move forward without the constant threat of discovery hanging over them. Margaret kept one plate as a reminder, as evidence that she had known and decided not to report, as the thing she would carry forward as her share of William's burden, her inheritance of his complicated legacy. And she wrote him one final letter in her notebook, acknowledging what she had discovered, explaining her decision, asking forgiveness from a man who was beyond granting it, but whose opinion she still cared about, whose memory she had no desire to tarnish, but whose truth she could not ignore. The summer passed into autumn, and then into winter again, their second winter in the shack that had become home, and life continued with the mundane persistence that life always has, the way it keeps going even when you think it can't, even when you think you've reached the end of your capacity for endurance or adaptation or acceptance of the world's fundamental unfairness. Emma grew tall and confident, her laughter returning with frequency that still surprised Margaret with its unexpectedness. It's proof that children could heal even from wounds that seemed permanent. Thomas lost his first tooth and started reading independently and became less quiet, less watchful, more willing to be loud and silly and take up space in the way children should be allowed to take up space. Their garden produced vegetables that they ate and preserved and shared with neighbors, creating connections that slowly, incrementally, made them part of the community rather than just people living at its edges. Margaret's cleaning business expanded through word of mouth, and she found herself occasionally needing to turn down jobs because she had more work than time, a problem she had never imagined having, a luxury that felt like abundance even though she was still poor by any objective measure, still struggling, still counting every dollar and making hard choices about what could be afforded and what had to wait. But the tenor of the struggle had changed, had moved from crisis management to life management, from survival mode to something that almost resembled normal. Whatever that meant for a family like theirs, for people who had fallen so far and climbed back up to a place that was not where they had been but was solid enough, was livable enough, was theirs. The box of counterfeit money remained hidden, a secret that Margaret had told no one except her children, who understood with the seriousness that children develop when they are trusted with adult information that it was never to be spoken about, never to be acknowledged, a truth they held together because families hold truths together, because some knowledge is too dangerous to share and too important to deny. Sometimes Margaret thought about it, wondered if she had made the right decision, if silence was complicity, if protecting William's memory made her accessories after the fact to crimes committed before she arrived. But mostly she let it be, let it exist as part of the complicated history of the place they lived, the man who had lived there before them. The ways that survival sometimes requires accepting grace, even when grace comes with thorns, even when the gift is complicated, even when nothing is as simple or as clean as you would prefer. They added William's medals and letters and photographs to their small archive, creating a memorial of sorts in a corner of the shack, an acknowledgement that he had been real, had mattered, had done both good and questionable things, had been fully human in all the contradictory ways humans are human. And sometimes when Margaret was working in the garden or feeding the chickens or standing in the doorway of the shack watching her children play in the yard they had cleared and claimed, she felt his presence not as a ghost, but as a continuity, as evidence that spaces hold the energy of the people who inhabit them. That generosity echoes even when it comes from complicated sources. That redemption is sometimes less about being perfect and more about trying, about helping, about refusing to. Give up even when the world gives you every reason to surrender. The story of the widow and her children forced to live in a burned shack did not end with revelation or transformation in any singular, dramatic sense. It ended the way most real stories end, in continuation, in ongoing effort, in the quiet accumulation of days that slowly add up to something that might be called a life, that might be called recovery, that might be called survival elevated to the level of living. Margaret would always carry the knowledge of what she had found in the shed, would always wonder if she had made the right decision, would always feel the weight of the secret she kept. But she would also carry the knowledge that her children were growing up safe and fed and loved, that they had a home, however imperfect, that they had climbed out of the deepest darkness she had ever experienced and found light again, however compromised, however complicated, however conditional. In that, she decided on a morning when the sun rose golden over their garden and the chickens chattered their morning greetings, and Emma and Thomas emerged from the shack rubbing sleep from their eyes and smiling at the day ahead. That was enough. Not perfect, not clean, not the ending she would have written if she had been given the choice. But enough. Enough to keep going, enough to build on, enough to justify the difficult choices and the moral compromises and the decision to accept grace even when grace came from sources she wished were simpler. Enough to let hope exist again, cautiously, tentatively, but genuinely, in the space between ruins and rebuilding, in the territory that belongs to people who refuse to accept that falling is the same as failing, that the bottom is permanent, that there is no way up from where the world pushes you down. The shack stood, scarred but solid, marked by fire but still standing, still sheltering, still performing the function shelter was meant to perform. And inside it, a family lived, equally scarred, equally marked, equally still standing. And that continuation, that stubborn persistence, that refusal to disappear even when everything conspired to erase them, that was the real transformation, the real discovery, the real treasure hidden beneath the floorboards of desperation and need. Not money, not objects, not anything you could count or hold, but something more essential, more permanent, more valuable. The understanding that you survive not by being perfect, but by being persistent, not by avoiding mistakes, but by learning from them, not by finding easy answers, but by accepting that sometimes the questions themselves are all you get, and that has to be enough. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of their struggle and their survival, then you understand why stories matter, why we tell them, why we need them, why they continue long after the words end. Hit that like button, subscribe, because there are more stories waiting to be told, more truths hiding in unexpected places, more proof that the human capacity for endurance and hope and love is greater than anything the universe can throw at us. Don't miss the next one.